In this lesson, I want us to just take a pause from adding any new features to our app and familiarize ourselves with a concept that in many ways informs a lot of what we build into our applications. And that concept is workload. Now, you may have already heard about workload or read a little bit about it, but I want to boil it down here to the absolute basics. We've talked already a few times about how we have these two environments in our application, right? The client and the server, or as we often also call them, the front end and the back end. And the server here, for simplicity, also encompasses everything to do with our database. Now, these two environments are both computers. What they do at a fundamental level is they take as an input electricity, and they convert that electricity into some kind of computational output. That might be pixels out on a screen, that might be data that's being sent over the internet back to your application. That might be an instruction to a database to add a new entry into the database. So the work that a computer is doing here to do useful stuff, let's just call that computation for simplicity. This is not a computer science lecture, but let's just understand that basic premise. Now, the cost of doing computation on the client is borne by your users. It's borne by specifically the battery on your user's device, right? Or an electricity bill if it's plugged into the socket in the wall. So your users themselves are incurring the cost for doing that computation, for converting that electricity into some kind of useful work in the context of your app. And the kinds of work that this client-side computer is doing are things like navigating between different views. It's anything involving custom states. It's changing the appearance of elements based on what other elements might be doing on the page. So it's these kind of things, showing a filters sheet, navigating to a different view within our app, storing these filter values in a custom state. These are all the things that are happening here on the client. But the server is also doing really important work. It's also doing computation. So the server is doing things like fetching or retrieving data. It's doing things like editing or updating data in the database. Anytime that we make changes to a thing in the database or we add a new thing into the database, the server is doing that work. It's also doing what we just learned about in the last two lessons, which is running or executing back-end workflows that are only happening within the context of this computer. They're running on this server computer. And it's also doing something which we're going to learn about very shortly, which is making API calls, which is just a fancy way of saying our application is triggering workflows that are happening on some other computer, some other system, like perhaps with OpenAI to generate AI responses, or with Google Cloud to generate some map-based search results. Both examples that we're going to deal with later in this section. So I want to go through these categories here and actually show you in practice how they relate to workload within the context of our app. So when I load my app like this, or I view a trip with a bunch of diary entries in it, that involves the server doing work. That is the process, as we've seen a few times now in the course, of the client requesting that the server provide it back some data to display. So the server is fetching data here and returning it to the client. And I can see this if I go down to this log section. I've got this app metrics tab, and this is giving me an overview of how my application is consuming workload units over time. Workload units is the name of this currency, if you will, this measure of the work that our application server is required to do to make our app run. And so you can see here that over the last 30 days, my application has consumed 196 workload units here on the 10th and 175 on the 11th. And depending on your plan, you're going to have a certain amount of workload units allocated to your project over the course of the month. And this tab also tells you how many workload units you've used within your capacity. You can also purchase more workload units here as well. But going back to this logs tab, what I can do is I can say, okay, let me actually view my workload usage only over the last hour. And if I scroll down, I can actually see a breakdown of the different activity types and how they've contributed to workload. And I'm actually just going to click on this little bar here, which is the workload units consumed for this minute, which was just a few minutes ago when we loaded up the trips view in our app. And so as a result, what I'm seeing is only one type of workload activity, which is fetching data. And that was the work required to display those trips out on the screen. And if I click into this, we get a breakdown of a few other subparts to this fetching data. And so there's actually a bunch of stuff going on here. There's the initial search, which corresponds to this data source here. We also have something called an aggregate search. That corresponds to whenever we're doing a count of things. And so we've got this group empty state on the page, which is doing a count operator. So that is what is corresponding to that aggregate. And so I'm not going to go through every single activity type here, but what you can do is go into the Bubble manual. They've got some really detailed guides on how workload works. And one of the pages in the guide actually outlines the base cost for doing different types of activities within your application. So you can see here that performing a database search, so retrieving data from the database, it has this base cost of 0.3 workload units. And then there's sort of additional costs on top of that. If we're going to retrieve 10 things from the database, well, each of those things is going to add 0.015 workload units. So if the users added a huge content field for their diary entry about their camping trip, right? Every character within that body of text is going to add some cost as well. And so all of these things are additive and result in the costs that you ultimately see here within the workload tab. Now, I show you all of this not to encourage you to track every last little decimal point of workload, which is really counterproductive, but just to give you a sense for how these things are working under the hood. It's really at scale when your application is being run by lots of different users multiple times a day, where these workload units add up. And that's where over the course of a week or a month, you can start to see where are the large categories of workload being allocated. And you can look at potentially ways of reducing the workload consumption for those activity types. Now, one of the other ways while we're here that you can track workload is by looking here in the server logs. And if I add 1 hour ago, what you can see here is that we ran a workflow action to delete a user account. And what Bubble is telling me here within these logs is that the cost for running that action was 0.70 workload units. So this is another place where you can get some visibility into the costs that your actions are incurring. But again, we want to be careful here about the time that we spend thinking about the costs that our application is incurring versus the end value that we're adding to our users, right? The right way to think about workload is to think of it like electricity, all right? When you run the lights in your application, when you turn the radio on, right? When you run the dishwasher, all of these things cost you money as a homeowner, right? They incur an electricity bill. That doesn't mean that you're not going to use those things. It just means that you're going to use them wisely. You're not going to use them wastefully. So workload needs to be thought about in the same way. There's always going to be some workload cost. You just have to decide whether or not it's worth it for a particular feature. So as my good friend and the author of the Bubble manual, Peter Amerly, says, features are investments. You've got to think about every new bit of functionality that you add to your application as something that's going to have some cost and workload. So you're going to have to invest some workload cost in order to make that feature happen, but you're going to reap some reward, right? That feature is going to provide some dividends in the form of value for your end users. And you've got to decide then what features are worth the cost. So as a silly example of this, let's say that we wanted to track the amount of times that we've viewed our trips, just like a YouTube video view counter. So we might have on our trip data type here a new field called views, which is a number type field. And what we're going to do is when the user opens up our trip details view here, we're going to increment or add 1 to that view value. And so if we assume that the views value starts at 0 for any new trip, then what we do is when the view is loaded, which is a workflow that we can set up by using a page is loaded event, we can go to data and make changes to the trip, which lives inside of trip details. And we can find that views field. And to increment this by 1, we can do something like taking the current value for this views field, which at the time that this trip was created is going to be 0. And then we just simply, because it's a number value, we add 1 to it. So if it starts at 0, 0 plus 1 is going to equal 1. If it's got 10 views, then 10 plus 1 is going to mean that it now has 11 views, and so on. And then let's say, for the sake of argument, that we just show the count of views here on the trip details view. So I'm going to display here that views value out on the screen. I'll just add a canvas placeholder here so it's kind of clear. So if I just create a new trip here just to test with, and I open it up, you see that the count of views is 1. If I close it and open it again, then now the count is 2. And you can see the cost here is 0.62 workload units for changing that views field. That doesn't seem that high. Actually, the entire cost, as we can see here, for running this entire workflow, which includes this action, is actually slightly higher, 1.12. And that's actually because what we're doing here is we are writing or modifying something in the database, which is 0.5 workload units, but we are also running a server-side workflow action. That is what a make changes to a thing action does. So we're adding those together, and there's always some degree of slight variance as well. So that's why we're getting 1.12 workload units. And you still might think, okay, that's not that much. You know, we've got 175,000 workload units a month here on the starter plan. But this is where you just need to work out, you know, is a feature like this worth it for your application? Does it add that much value? Because if this was an app similar to YouTube, you know, users are watching and viewing a lot of things created by other users. You know, even if we're talking about 1,000 things, trips, videos, what have you, being viewed each 1,000 times, so 1,000 times 1,000, right? And we're doing that every day. Well, now we're looking at 30 million workload units, which is obviously a lot more than the allowance here on the starter plan. So that's quite an extreme example, but I put it there just to sort of highlight that we shouldn't just be adding features left, right, and center just because we can. We should be having this mental model in our head about the client and the server and thinking about what work needs to be done to make this feature actually happen. And now one of the places in our app specifically where I think I could maybe optimize something relatively easily is that on our login view here, I set up an action a couple of lessons ago, which was canceling a scheduled backend workflow for a user. And to run that workflow costs 0.70 workload units. It's really tiny. And while I'm just building my first version, testing with a handful of users, I'm not going to feel this at all. But, you know, at scale, if I've got 1,000 users logging into my app every day, then that's 700 workload units each day. So times 30, that's 21,000 workload units over the course of the month that maybe I don't need to be spending. And so what I can always do is for an action like this that I don't actually need to run for every single user who logs in, I only want this to run for users who have tried to delete their account. And so I have this data point accessible to me for those users, which is, do they have a delete request ID or not, right? So what I could always do is I could only run this action when the current user's delete request ID is not empty. And for good measure, I could also make changes to the current user in this scenario as well when they don't have an empty delete request ID, and actually just erase that delete request ID. In other words, to set it to be nothing. So that's going to cost some workload, but then the user's already logged in. It's going to cost no extra workload for the client, the user's device, to check whether or not this request ID field is empty or not. And so if it's empty, then these two actions are just going to be skipped, and I'm not going to be incurring that extra workload. And so if I test this out by logging in here as a user who's not trying to delete their account, and then I go into the server logs and just search for 2 minutes ago, I see here that I have got a log the user in action that cost 0.92 workload units. But then these actions here to cancel the scheduled API workflow have this action condition failed, right? Because of this condition that we just added not being met. And so there is a tiny, tiny amount of workload here in evaluating this condition, but that is still a lot less than where I don't have this condition and I go to log in here as an ordinary user who's not trying to delete their account, because then what I have is 0.62 workload units. And you might even decide that the 0.02 workload units to evaluate this action is too much. And then what you could do is not have this 24-hour grace period, but just delete the user's account right away. And then you don't have to worry about having this action when the user logs in to remove the workflow to delete their account and all of these associated extra workload costs. But in short, what I really want to convey here is that, yes, this is sort of how it works under the hood, and this is what you should be mindful of so that you're not careless. But equally, we shouldn't really get obsessed about this too much, especially while we're building a new idea that we just want to test with some users or get some early market validation, right? So workload here is a tool. It's a tool that lets our app do useful stuff. We have to remember that.